I was asked if I too, although John said a lot of things, would talk about the British referendum and explain why I personally am in favour of voting for Britain to leave. I realise that is a very shocking thing to say to people in this audience. I hope you'll forgive me. It is what I've been asked to say. In mitigation of my position, I ought to say that I've not always been in favour of leaving. We had a referendum in 1975 to confirm our membership. I voted to confirm our membership then. My very first speech that I made in the House of Commons, what we call our maiden speech, I made in favour of our joining the EEC. But unfortunately, I, rather like John, have come to the conclusion over the years that this has not really worked for us. I think, as John said, Britain has always been rather a reluctant member. We didn't join the European Steel and Coal community at the beginning. America was urging us to do so. Churchill resisted. Contrary to the quotations that are so often bandied about, Churchill was never in favour of Britain joining and always felt that Britain had a more global outlook, it had its ties to America, and that the closer political union should be for the other European countries. I think Britons have always seen their membership of the EU as an economic matter. When we held the referendum in 1975, it was presented to the British people as essentially about economics. There was a categorical assurance given during that previous referendum that there was no question of a single currency. It was absolutely ruled out. We were told that the supremacy of European law over British law was confined to essentially economic matters. Well, since then, things in Europe have changed very much. The common market, the EEC, became the EC, the European Community, then the European Union. We had the treaties of Maastricht, of Lisbon, of Nice, and all sorts of powers were accrued to Europe. Europe began to interfere much more in justice and home affairs. Foreign policy, which used to be an intergovernmental area, became to some extent a union competence. And of course, we had the single currency. Britain was always very uneasy about all these developments, which is why, as John said, Britain had a series of opt-outs. We had an opt-out from Schengen. We don't participate in that. We had an opt-out from the social chapter, then Tony Blair threw that away, and some of it has since been recaptured. And above all, we had the non-participation, the opt-out from the single currency. That was something I myself negotiated on behalf of the British government in 1991 to 92, when I went to these monthly meetings talking about this faraway theoretical idea of the euro. And frankly, my meetings there were, I think it was the worst year of my life. It was a dialogue of the deaf because the other finance ministers refused to believe that Britain would not join, refused to believe me when I expressed considerable skepticism about whether the euro would ever work. I always remember my Greek opposite number at Maastricht, who was twice as broad, believe it or not, as me, and twice as tall, and he put his arm round me in front of everyone and said, Norman, you say you will never join the euro, but when the time comes, you will want to show solidarity with Greece. Well, thank goodness we never did. As John said, there has been rising disillusionment, is the word I would use, with Europe in the UK. David Cameron is often criticised as having brought about this referendum for internal Conservative Party reasons. Frankly, I think that's an unfair criticism. You can hardly expect a party leader to ignore the fact that there's another party called the UK Independence Party, whose sole and main objective is to withdraw from the EU, to hold a referendum. You can hardly blame him if he doesn't want to ignore this. That is what democracy is about. It's about responding to what people want, people are demanding. And I think it was inevitable, and I think it was the right thing for David Cameron to do, to promise the British people a referendum, the first one for 45 years after there had been all these great, great changes in the EU. David Cameron set out his criteria for the renegotiation in a speech given at Bloomberg, where, as John said, he talked about making Europe more competitive, returning powers to national parliaments, getting more control of our borders. But it was very widely perceived that, echoing Dickens' famous novel Oliver Twist, that what you got was very thin gruel indeed, very little. In fairness to the Prime Minister, or perhaps it's not in fairness to him, he seems to have anticipated his rather modest achievements, because he always made it clear that he would probably recommend Britain to stay in the EU. But the government tried to present the outcome of the renegotiation as a fundamental change in our relationship with Europe, which had been achieved as a result of this negotiation. But I think very few people believed that, and that is why we are where we are. I have found it extremely difficult to make up my mind on this issue. One reason for that is just I don't like being in a position where I am in conflict with the leader of my party, David Cameron. Some of you may or may not, well, you probably no reason why you should know, that David Cameron, when I was the finance minister of the UK, used to work for me. He was my speechwriter. And I always remember, we had quite a tough time when I was finance minister, and I remember on one occasion, he was a very, very good speechwriter, David Cameron, but I always remember on one occasion where things were very rough, David Cameron gave me a present of a very long, thin mahogany box. It was literally this long, it was about that broad, and it contained the biggest Cuban cigar you've ever seen in your life. And he attached to it a bright yellow note, you know those yellow pieces of paper you stick, and it said, "Dear Norman, once you smoke this, all your troubles will be over." Well, I never ever did smoke it. I've still got it, and I'm thinking of sending it back to him with the same note. So, personally, it's quite difficult for me, but secondly, it is a big, radical change in British policy. It's quite something to admit we've invested all this time, and that the second option of Roy Jenkins has proved to be the correct analysis. I came to the conclusion that I would vote leave, really for two reasons. The first is that the single currency has become the main focus, the main reason for the existence almost of the European Union. And all the measures, all the energy, all the thinking of the EU is going into shoring up the euro. The euro, of course, has been, to my mind, a historic failure. You can't get anyone in the Eurozone to admit that. They're in denial about it. But I think you just have to look at the track record, which is quite a long track record now, the dismal growth, the series of crises, the failure, as John said, really to resolve the conflict between North and South, the failure to resolve the Greek crisis. I think indisputably it is a failure. But European, I know I said that the other day to a meeting of former European Union ministers. They all exploded in anger. The idea that the euro is a failure, well, you could have fooled me, and I think you could find very few people in the UK who would think the euro is anything other than a failure. And it is dragging Europe down. It is dragging our main trading partner down, which is an argument why we want to have less to do with it. But almost everything that could be done to shore up the euro has overspill effects onto Britain. Now, John in his talk made the point that maybe other countries won't join the euro. Maybe Hungary won't join the euro. Hungary, in theory, has a legal obligation to join the euro. In theory, every country outside the euro within the EU, other than Sweden and Britain, has a legal obligation. In theory, We could have a situation where Britain and Sweden were the only two countries not in the euro. Be that as it may, the eurozone is already a qualified majority blocking, a majority voting, a majority bloc within the EU. So is there any point in really belonging to an organization whose main purpose is one that you do not share? The monetary union that you know is going to lead to more fiscal union, more and more regulation, is going to lead to integration in lots of areas that you might not wish to join. The second reason why I have decided to vote to leave is because Europe is on the road to becoming a political union. You can call it a federal Europe, a United States of Europe. I prefer just to quote what Elmar Brok, the MEP close eye of Mrs. Merkel, said when he said, Europe is a country under construction. A country under construction. We're building a new country. When President Hollande was appearing before the European Parliament and he was provoked by some rigorous heckling from the UKIP members of Parliament in the European Parliament, and President Hollande responded to this by saying, the question is, do you wish to leave a European state or not? Now, when I supported joining the EEC in the 1970s, one used to worry about this rhetoric about creating a united Europe, a political Europe, and one was always told, they don't really mean it. It's all words. It will never happen. But since then, we've seen Europe accrete more and more power to the centre. We've seen a directly elected parliament come, which was never mentioned at the time. And I discovered, when I was finance minister and I went to these negotiations about Europe, I discovered for the first time in my life that everything people said about political union, they meant. I always remember my first meeting with my French opposite number, a very, very nice man called Pierre Bérégovoy, who tragically committed suicide some years later, who became Prime Minister of France. But I remember he said to me, almost the first thing he said to me when he met was, Norman, I want my children to live in a United States of Europe. Well, frankly, I don't believe in that, and most British people do not believe in that. And the psychology and the history of Britain in many ways is perhaps different from that of our continental partners and neighbours. To my mind, you can only operate democracy at the level of the nation state. I'm sure you've heard this point before, but I think it's essential to remind people of it. The word democracy consists of two elements, two words. Kratos, meaning power, and demos, meaning people. And for democracy to work, you need to have a people. And I don't believe there is, at this stage, a European demos. I don't believe that the people of Riga and Lisbon, or of Copenhagen and Bucharest, are all voting or thinking about the same concerns. There isn't a European people. The French are a people, the Hungarians are a people, the Germans are a people, the Swiss are a people, despite the fact that they have several different languages. Umberto Eco, the Italian writer, once said, there is such a thing as European identity, but it is a very shallow identity compared with national identity. And I think with a European Parliament which represents everybody and nobody, we are really throwing away the essence of democracy. The essence of democracy, the sacred principle is that those who make our laws should be accountable to us. Those who make our laws, we should be able to sack them. We should be able to get rid of them. We should be able to get those laws reversed. That is impossible for us within the European Union. We have 10% of the votes in the Parliament, 8% of the votes in the Council of Ministers, or it may be the other way around. But we have lost many, many votes on quite important things, and frankly, I think people feel that more and more Europe is becoming remote from them. Democracy and lawmaking should not be a one-way process. You should be able to repeal a law once it has been passed, but it has been incredibly difficult to do that in the EU because you have to get different national coalitions together in order to reverse something that has become part of this massive acquis communautaire that goes on accumulating law after law after law. I don't think it's any use saying that the Parliament is elected, the European Parliament is elected. You could elect a world Prime Minister. Every country in the world could vote for a Prime Minister of the world, and you would represent every country in the world. But what real connection would he have with public opinion in every single country of the world? So I think we have a real conflict between national democracy and the building of these multinational institutions. And I think, as John said, we saw that very much in the Greek crisis. I don't for 1 minute excuse the mismanagement and the profligacy of previous Greek governments, who, let me say, were to some extent conservative governments or social democrat governments, not the Syriza government that came to power. But I found it shocking that you should have a situation in which you had both an election and a referendum in which people rejected the policies that were being imposed on them, and they were just told, these are the rules, this is what you've legislated for in the past. That is not democracy and is not something that, in my mind, can endure. We hear a lot about how Europe creates goodwill between countries, contributes to peace. I think NATO is the real contributor to peace, but on good relations and tension, I always remember at the time the euro was being considered, an article was written in a magazine called Foreign Affairs by a very renowned American Nobel Prize-winning economist, Martin Feldstein. He actually wrote an article saying that the euro, the headline of the article was, "The euro makes war in Europe more likely." Well, that's rather over the top, but he had a profound point that the euro was likely to increase tensions in Europe because it was creating a situation of incompatible demands from different countries on common institutions. And this, he said, will give rise to great tensions in Europe. And sure it did. Who would have thought we would have seen Greeks parading in Nazi uniforms and shouting at Mrs. Merkel in the way we did? Is that what Europe is about? Is that a good thing? So those are the two reasons why I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that the only way ahead for Britain is to leave. The single market, which was mentioned, I think is largely a myth and largely a paradox. The myth is that it has really helped our exports. Frankly, I don't think it's helped our exports hardly at all, if at all. Europe had some liberalizing influence in the 60s when tariffs were high. Since then, I think very little has happened in way of extra trade generation. It may and will have created extra trade, obviously, for the post-communist economies that were locked into the Western economy for the first time. But in overall terms, I think the effect, we love to talk about the single market. You referred to it, Mr. Chairman, as the great British achievement. We love all that. And you can always tell a bad point is going to be made when other people mention Mrs. Thatcher. And people say Mrs. Thatcher loved the single market. I'm sure John will bear out with me. Mrs. Thatcher profoundly regretted the creating of the single market. She profoundly regretted the introduction of majority voting because she felt it was being used and abused in areas well outside the economic area. So, if you will forgive me, I believe that the political road on which Europe is embarked is one that can only end in increasing tension disputes between countries, and disillusionment with the remoteness of government. So I do think we need some European architecture. I do think we need some institutions in Europe. I do think we need collaboration and partnership. But I think the model we've built is completely the wrong one. And so the positive way to look at Brexit is going to save Europe. Brexit is the only way in which people will rethink Europe, go back to square one, and come up with some better ideas from those that we have at present. Thank you very much.